Welcome back to the deep dive. Just looking at this stack of research for today, um, it's fascinating, really. The sixth mass extinction. I mean, it seems like such a polarizing topic, doesn't it? You've got people on one side who are like absolutely terrified, convinced it's the end of the world as we know it, and then you've got others who are like, nah, it's all hype, nothing to see here.
And then, of course, you've got that whole other group, the conspiracy theorists, who see something sinister lurking behind it all.
Right, exactly. And that's what I'm really curious about today. Is this a real threat? Are we overreacting? Or is there something more to this, something we're not being told?
Well, I think what makes this so intriguing is that we're not just talking about science here. It's a blend of science, psychology, even politics, you could say. It's not just about what we know, but how we interpret what we know and why.
So let's start with the science then. You've got like a mountain of research here. And from what I've been reading, it seems pretty clear, at least from a scientific perspective, that the Earth is in fact experiencing a sixth mass extinction event.
Yeah, the scientific consensus is pretty strong on this one. And the evidence, as you said, is pretty compelling. It's not just a handful of species disappearing here and there. We're talking about a widespread decline across numerous ecosystems.
I was reading one of these articles earlier and mentioned a study about insect populations. Like in some regions, they've plummeted by something like 75% in just the past few decades. That's insane, right?
Yeah, that's a pretty alarming statistic. And it highlights a key point that a lot of these sources emphasize: the interconnectedness of ecosystems. We lose insects, we lose the birds, the amphibians, even mammals that rely on them for food.
It's like a domino effect. And it's not just about, one animal eating another. Insects they're vital for pollination, decomposition, nutrient cycling, all these things that keep ecosystems healthy.
Exactly. They're kind of the unsung heroes of the natural world, and their decline has far-reaching consequences.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all, to be honest. Like when I hear extinction, my mind immediately jumps to dinosaurs, something that happened millions of years ago. It feels so distant, so abstract. But what these sources are saying is this isn't some far-off event. It's happening now. It's happening because of us.
Right, and that's a crucial point. These sources are very clear that human activities are the primary driver of this crisis. Habitat destruction, pollution, climate change, overexploitation of resources, it all comes back to us.
So, okay, we've established the science is pretty solid on this, but let's talk about the elephant in the room, the conspiracy theories. You've got some articles here about people who, well, they don't buy it. They think the whole thing is being downplayed or even orchestrated by some shadowy group or organization.
I mean, it's understandable why people might be drawn to those kinds of explanations. We're talking about a potentially catastrophic event here. It's natural to want to find someone or something to blame, to make sense of it all.
Some of these theories are pretty wild, though. Like I was reading one about elites building underground bunkers, hoarding resources, preparing for the apocalypse, while the rest of us are left to fend for ourselves. It's like something out of a science fiction movie.
Well, it's important to remember that conspiracy theories often thrive on fear and uncertainty. And in a situation like this, where we're dealing with a global crisis that's complex and frankly terrifying, those fears are understandably heightened.
But where do we draw the line between healthy skepticism and just plain unfounded speculation? I mean, it's one thing to be wary of corporate influence or government inaction, but to claim that the entire scientific community is in on some grand cover-up, that seems like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it?
You're right. It's about finding that balance, and that's where critical thinking comes in. We need to be able to evaluate information, consider the source, and separate fact from fiction.
One of the things that struck me go through these sources was the role of psychology in all of this. There's this concept called confirmation bias, right? Where we tend to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, even if those beliefs aren't necessarily grounded in reality.
Right. Confirmation bias is a powerful force, and it can be especially strong when we're dealing with emotionally charged topics like this. If you're already inclined to believe that something sinister is going on, you're more likely to latch onto information that supports that belief, even if it's flimsy or lacking context.
So how do we navigate this? How do we sift through all the noise, all the conflicting information, and get to the truth, especially with a topic as complex as this one?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that we'll be exploring further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be talking about strategies for evaluating information, recognizing our own biases, and ultimately reclaiming our power as informed and engaged citizens. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Before we went to ad break, we were talking about how challenging it could be to really make sense of all the information out there, especially when it comes to something like the sixth mass extinction.
It really is. It's like you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, right?
Yeah.
You've got all this scientific evidence, all these dire predictions, then you've got all these conspiracy theories swirling around, muddying the waters.
And it's easy to get caught up in the emotional pull of it all too. Right, exactly. I mean, how do you even begin to separate fact from fiction when everyone's got an agenda and you're constantly bombarded with all this conflicting information?
Well, one of the first things we need to be aware of is our own biases, right? We all have them, whether we realize it or not, and they can have a huge impact on how we perceive and process information.
You mentioned confirmation bias earlier, right? That tendency to gravitate towards information that reinforces what we already believe,
Yeah.
even if it's not entirely accurate.
Exactly. And that's just one of many cognitive biases that can influence our judgment. There's also the availability heuristic, for example.
Availability heuristic.
Yeah, it basically means that we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or vividly imagined. So, for example, if you're constantly exposed to sensationalized news stories about ecological disasters, it's easy to start thinking that those events are more common, more likely to happen than they actually are.
Ah, that makes sense. But like the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" phenomenon in the media.
Exactly. The more dramatic, the more fear-inducing the story, the more likely it is to grab our attention and stick with us. And that can distort our perception of reality.
So, okay, we've got these biases working against us. But how do we overcome them? How do we become more critical thinkers, more discerning consumers of information, especially when it comes to something as complex and frankly scary as the sixth mass extinction?
Well, one of the sources you showed actually had a really interesting analogy. It compared critical thinking to being a detective.
Put a detective.
Yeah, like a good detective wouldn't just jump to conclusions based on a single piece of evidence, right? They'd gather information from multiple sources, they'd evaluate the credibility of those sources, they'd look for patterns and inconsistencies.
So it's about being skeptical, but not necessarily cynical. It's about questioning everything, not just the things that we disagree with.
Exactly. It's about developing a healthy skepticism, an approach to information where you're open-minded, but you're also discerning. You're demanding evidence. You're not just taking things at face value.
Another thing that came up in these sources was the importance of seeking out diverse perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
Not just listening to people who agree with us, but actively seeking out viewpoints that challenge our own assumptions.
That's a really important point, because if we only surround ourselves with people who think the same way we do, we're not really growing, are we? We're not challenging our own biases. We're just reinforcing them.
It's like that saying, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And if those 5 people all share the same beliefs, the same worldview, well, you're not going to get a very balanced perspective, are you?
And when it comes to something as complex as the sixth mass extinction, that kind of intellectual isolation can be really dangerous, because you're making decisions, you're forming opinions based on a very limited, a very skewed view of reality.
So, okay, we need to be aware of our biases. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to seek out diverse perspectives. But how do we actually do that? I mean, in practice, especially in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides, and social media algorithms seem designed to keep us in these little echo chambers where we only see what we want to see.
Well, one thing we can do is be more intentional about where we get our information from. Instead of just relying on social media or news outlets that cater to a specific ideology, make an effort to seek out information from reputable scientific organizations, academic journals, independent fact-checking websites.
It's about going beyond the headlines, right? Actually taking the time to dig deeper, to read the research, to understand the nuances of the issue.
Exactly. And it's also about being aware of our own emotional triggers. If you're reading something and you find yourself getting really angry or really scared or really defensive, that's a sign that you might be reacting emotionally rather than than rationally.
So take a deep breath, take a step back, and ask yourself, okay, what's the evidence here? And what might be influencing my interpretation of that evidence?
Exactly. And another helpful strategy is to actually engage in dialogue with people who hold different viewpoints. Instead of just dismissing someone who believes in a conspiracy theory, for example. Try to understand where they're coming from. What are the underlying anxieties that might be driving those beliefs?
I think that's tough though, right?
Yeah.
Especially in today's climate, where everyone seems so polarized, so quick to judge and dismiss anyone who doesn't agree with them.
It is tough, but it's also really important if we want to have meaningful conversations about complex issues like this. It's not about convincing everyone to agree with us. It's about fostering a climate of respect and open-mindedness where we can learn from each other and work together to find solutions.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, right? Even if we don't always see eye to eye,
Right.
we all share this planet. We all have a stake in its future.
Well said. And that brings us to a really crucial question. What can we as individuals actually do to address the challenges of the sixth mass extinction? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, to feel like our actions don't really matter. But there are things we can do both individually and collectively to make a difference.
That's what I'm really interested in exploring, because after diving into all this research, all this science, all this psychology, I have to admit I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed myself. But also a sense of urgency, like we need to do something. We need to find ways to turn things around.
I think that's a very natural response, and it's a good thing, because that sense of urgency, that's what drives action, and that's what we'll be focusing on in the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring practical strategies for making a difference, from individual actions we can take in our daily lives to broader systemic changes that we can advocate for.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground so far, haven't we? The science behind the sixth mass extinction, the psychology, the conspiracy theories. It's a lot to process.
It is. It's a heavy topic for sure, but I think it's important that we don't get bogged down in the doom and gloom, because at the end of the day, the question is, what can we do about it?
Right, exactly. And that's what I'm really curious about now, because it's easy to feel powerless in the face of something this big, this global, but these sources, they do offer some hope, some concrete steps we can take to make a difference.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize, because I know a lot of people, they hear about the sixth mass extinction and they feel overwhelmed. They feel like there's nothing they can do. But that's simply not true.
One of the articles you included talked about sustainable living practices, reducing our carbon footprint, things like that. And I've been trying to be more mindful of my own consumption habits, but honestly, sometimes it feels like a drop in the bucket,
Well, sure, individual actions alone aren't going to solve a global crisis, but they do matter. They really do. Every time you choose to walk or bike instead of drive, every time you opt for a reusable bag instead of a plastic one, every time you reduce your meat consumption, you're sending a signal. You're saying that you care about the environment, that you're willing to make changes in your own life to protect it. And those signals, they add up. They can influence others. They can create a ripple effect.
It's about creating a culture of sustainability, right?
Yeah.
Not just about individual actions, but about a collective shift in how we live, how we consume, how we interact with the planet.
Exactly. And there are so many ways to contribute to that cultural shift. One of the articles you shared talked about supporting organizations that are working on conservation, climate action, environmental justice. And that's huge. Donating to these organizations, volunteering your time, even just spreading awareness about their work. Those are all really meaningful ways to make a difference.
There's also political advocacy, right? Contacting our elected officials, demanding policies that prioritize environmental protection and sustainability.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's essential. It's easy to feel like our individual voices don't matter, but when we come together, when we make our voices heard, we can make a real difference in the political landscape. We can push for change at a systemic level.
It's easy to get discouraged when you look at the scale of the problem, when you see how much damage has already been done. But these sources, they do offer a sense of hope, a sense that we can turn things around, that we can create a better future for ourselves and for future generations. It's not going to be easy, but it's possible.
It is possible, and that's the message that I really hope people take away from this deep dive. That yes, the sixth mass extinction is a very real and very serious threat, but it's not inevitable. We still have time to change course. We still have time to make a difference. It's going to require a collective effort, a willingness to change our habits, to challenge the status quo, to demand more from our leaders. But it's worth fighting for.
I couldn't agree more. And on that note, I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you some food for thought, some inspiration to take action. And we'd love to hear from you. What resonated with you? What are you going to do to make a difference? Let us know in the comments below.